that food is cool. No secret. Eat that food with a bowl and spoon. Everyone knows that food is cool. No secret. Eat that food with a bowl and spoon.
Hi, welcome to With Bowl and Spoon. I'm Shelly Danko Day. Today, my guest is Chris Sue, who was working with me at the city in a voluntary capacity for several years. Hi, Chris. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hey, my name is Chris Sue, and I Taiwanese American and currently in Silver Spring, Maryland. Yeah, I guess to start off on the prompt of a personal food evolution, I think the best way to start, I think, is with what a big part of Taiwanese culture around food and what that entails. And one of the traditional kind of greetings you have in Taiwan, in Taiwanese, is "jiababui," which basically roughly translates to "have you eaten yet?" But it has a much deeper connotation when it's said. It's not just about have you had food, but it's really asking like, how are you doing? How are you as a person? And that sense of being fed is not just a kind of physical feeling of food, but also something that goes beyond that. And yeah, so I think that's kind of where, for me, I would say the journey with food really begins.
Did you know that was kind of a greeting here in Pittsburgh too when you decided to move here?
I did not. Because I moved for undergrad at Carnegie Mellon, so I had no idea.
I'm halfway teasing, but on all of the Pittsburghese mugs and materials, you'll see Jeet Jet, and that's what that means, a Jeet Yet.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that was a Taiwanese greeting, and that's lovely. And it's kind of ironic, but it is pretty funny. So yeah, let's talk about, you went to CMU. So you weren't, besides your cultural food world, food wasn't necessarily your career.
Yeah, so I went into undergrad studying computer science. I grew up all around computers and just really, I thought I knew what I was getting into with computer science because I like computers. And I said, oh, I don't like math that much, so let me do computer science and not a math degree. It turns out computer science is basically a math degree. But I slogged my way through it at Carnegie Mellon, graduated, started working at Google. But throughout my life, I think I've always felt a lot of passion around food, but also a level of distance, you could say, of how to engage with it. So I think growing up, both my parents would cook together in the kitchen and just very, very proficient making kind of like a 3-course meal in like 30 minutes, putting it out on the table for our family. I think that was always hard to enter into because to try to help meant really slowing things down. And I think that created a certain distance from feeling like I had the opportunity to engage with food, particularly with cooking. And also my sister is an excellent both chef, also baker. She actually was just a contestant on a baking show on Fox. It was a crime scene kitchen, and she and a friend were there. And so, yeah, growing up, very much surrounded by people who were very proficient in the kitchen, also proficient in navigating food cultures, I guess, like in even like going into a grocery store and just knowing where things were. And I always kind of felt like an outsider actually with that. And so I think that was, for me, an area of always a lot of interest, but always some distance as well in that domain of food.
In Taiwanese culture, is it typical that mostly women cook and not men? Or was that just were you the kind of kid that was just like, I don't want to be in the way, and so you kind of took that on yourself, or was that a cultural thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So from what I can tell, at least in both of my own families, men cooking was actually a very common thing. So my grandpa, my mom's side, and my mom's dad just really loved to cook, really loved to, growing up, I remember he would always be in the kitchen, like putting something together for all of us and making sure there was so much food for us. And even when he got to the point where he wasn't really able to cook or be in the kitchen anymore, he would just order so much food to make sure we were fed. On my dad's side, like as well, like one of my uncles actually owned a bakery in Taiwan. Is also really big into cooking different kinds of Buddhist vegan food. And yeah, so I think just grew up around where like it definitely was very normal for men to be in the kitchen. I think for me, I wanted to be there, but I was often dissuaded for like maybe not cutting something right, or like, yeah, just I think slowing down the process of the preparation of food. So that I think the distance kind of came from that, where it was like, oh, like I really want to cook too. And I remember going to like a cooking camp. Both my sister and I went, and I loved watching Iron Chef. But I think actually being in the kitchen, it was hard to do. Like I think with so much expertise that I was surrounded by, I often felt like, oh, I can't like really be in this space because I'm in the way.
That's really a shame. I'm so sorry. So you talked about growing up, and you grew up in Dayton, Ohio.
Yeah, so I think in relation to food, definitely a lot of interesting, I think, elements. I'll say two that really stand out to me. The first being in around Dayton, like much less diverse than where I am now in Montgomery County, Maryland, but in Montgomery County, Ohio, their engagement that I had with food growing up was kind of this fascination with mainstream American Midwestern foods. And a big part of that, I remember like middle school going over to a friend's house and just being enamored to have meatloaf for the first time. And being like, wow, this is like the best thing that I've ever had. I think just a lot of different foods that, at home we wouldn't eat, but it was just like, it felt in a way, I guess, interesting, like exotic. It was like, like this is like really special, even though it's, very normal everyday food for my friends. And I think the other aspect was, I think the very strong like culture around independence. And I think a big part of that kind of flourished into the positive way, I would say, is around like gardening and small scale agriculture. And I think in high school, that was something that my friends and I really got into, actually, really surrounded by a desire that we could live off the land on our own. But in the process, we just learned a lot about composting and how to grow things in the garden and how to do things like naturally and all these different things, which not necessarily with a lens of like that, like, oh, we think the world around us needs to change or something like that. But like, oh, there's all these things that are wrong, but maybe we can do it right by ourselves. So yeah, I got really into doing a lot of different like gardening things and trying things out, and learning. One of my friends, I remember going over to his grandma's house, and we like learned how to can from her. She must have thought it was pretty funny to have two high school boys standing next to her to like learn how to can some vegetables and store them for the future. But yeah, so I think those are two like strong kind of threads around food from growing up in Dayton.
That must have been a trip for her to have the teenage boys learning how to can. That's amazing. Very cool. So then you moved to Pittsburgh and you go to CMU, and then you worked for Google. Let's start there, because you had another sort of real pivot point there.
Yeah. So I think one of the big journeys I had in college was really around, I think in high school, where I think agriculture and food, there was a big piece of that definitely centered around maybe you could say like a little bit more like individualistic and kind of like I just need to do this right for myself kind of take. I guess there was also a thread from back in Ohio too. I also spent a lot of time in high school actually volunteering at this soup kitchen. And one of the things that was really, I think, innovative about that soup kitchen in particular was that the whole goal was that you would not only serve the guests who came in, but really treating them with a lot of respect, and then even sitting down to share the meal with them and get to know them. And I think that was just a really powerful experience and very, very humanizing for me, especially I think growing up in the suburbs as well of Dayton. There was so much built-in fear that so many adults had around going into the city and spending time, especially with people who might be unhoused and needing to live on the streets for whatever reason. And I think that was just a really, I think that thread really grew in college of the sense of like, okay, there's things that are unjust in the world, things that are not right, where people don't have access to all the things they need. And I think questioning through college of like, what does that mean for me, and what do I kind of do with that information? And I think especially in Pittsburgh, there's such a strong like nonprofit community that surrounds food and food systems and making sure people have food and all these things. And yeah, I think once I graduated from college, that was a big question for me. I was like, okay, like what do I do? What do I go with this sense of like I want to make sure people are fed, like but I don't know really where to start. There's all these organizations. They all seem to be doing really cool, great things, but where do I fit in? And I think in a similar way, I guess that's kind of like the whole part of the growing up experience of like, oh, I want to be in this kitchen too, but like I'm not sure where I fit in. So where do I go next?
So where did you go next?
Yeah. So I went to there was a food conference going on in Pittsburgh. I don't know if it still goes on now, but I don't even remember what it was called. I remember meeting a ton of the different organizations.
Do you know who put it on?
I honestly can't remember, but it was.
Was it Farm to Table, maybe?
Yeah, Farm to Table. Yep. So I think I met so many people while I was there, and I think it was all so inviting and warm, and also just seeing like all the connections that existed between the different communities, and just really inspiring. And I think kind of asking the question then of like, oh, like, yeah, like where do I plug in, and maybe like, do I volunteer or what not? Like what's my next action here? And came across the Chatham University table, and they talked about having a food studies program. And so that really piqued my interest and really got me thinking about, oh, maybe there's opportunity here to go to grad school and actually learn more holistically about the food system and kind of see like what, where do I fit into this whole picture of everything.
You went to Chatham, and that's where we met.
Mm-hmm.
You started what, in 2014, 15?
No, 2000 must have been 2018.
18. Wow, was it that late?
Yep.
I feel like I've known you forever, Chris.
Yeah, so once I started at Chatham, I actually, which for whatever reason I can't remember, I ended up actually applying for the sustainability program and not actually the food studies program. They're in the same school, the Falk School of Sustainability. But yeah, for whatever reason, I chose the sustainability track. And I think once I started going, I was clearly really interested in food sustainability and really wanting to connect in there. And I took one food studies course my first semester, and it was MIM's class around food insecurity. And I think that class was one just like really, really eye-opening for me. I felt like it basically kind of completely changed my perspective on the world in a way, which I feel like is rare in school. Not every class necessarily does that. Like, oh, I learned something interesting. It was kind of fun. But yeah, I think really changed my perspective of seeing that, oh, okay, here are the realities of like, first, how do we define food insecurity? And once we have some definitions, like what are the realities and like what are actually potential solutions, and really realizing quickly that I think my ideas going into before starting grad school around, what did it really mean for people to be fed, that ultimately it had to do with more than just one person trying to do something. And like, not that a nonprofit or a charity or soup kitchen, any of these things were like bad things, because they do such a role in like humanizing individual people, which is so critical. But in talking about an entire system and how do we shift systemic change, and not only that, how many levers and opportunity there are to change systemic issues, but often are just blocked because of preconceived notions or narratives and political things that really open my eyes of like, oh, how much opportunity there could be potentially on a policy scale for how we can move the needle on food. And I think that being a thread of like really wanting to dig into like, yeah, there's all these different things that exist already that are really great to help people, and a lot of existing programs and all these things, but so often they're held back from their full potential because people are worried about things that don't actually have any real data behind it, but they've crafted a narrative around that. So I think just really digging into that was something where at the time I was like, I really want to dive into the world of like food policy and really wanting to dig deeper into like that end to end of what is food, how do we consume it, how do we define it, and how does it like define us in so many ways, in cultural ways. And so yes, ended up switching into the food studies program.
It's so beautiful. That is really just such a great way to put it, Chris. I love that. So you do the food studies and you're talking about policy, and I'm guessing, is this about the time that we met?
Yeah, I think you came for maybe it was like a little mini conference summit or some talk, which I think we were all invited to. And I remember just hearing about like the food policy related work that had gone on in the city of Pittsburgh. And I think it was the different urban ag legislation and the adopt a lot work in Pittsburgh. And I think that was also, I think, really eye-opening of like, oh yeah, sometimes it's, it's not a huge change on paper per se. Like you tweak a couple of words on a piece of paper, but the implications can be just so big. You just add a sentence, delete a couple of words, and suddenly everything, the possibilities can change. And so I think that was just a really exciting, I think, opportunity to consider. And so, yeah, I think when we had to do a kind of internship while part of the graduate program. And so, yeah, I reached out to you from there to, try to see how I could plug in.
Yeah. And plugged in you did. Yeah. You're talking about the tiny little change when we changed the word homeowner to residents in the urban ag zoning code, like that just opened up the door. And now we're seeing that there are a lot more people who don't want to own a house. They just want to rent, but they want to have chickens or they want to have bees or bring their beehive with them. And now they can. So you're right. One little word. And you did help to change some words while you were at the city. So let's get into that, I guess. So when you started working with us at the city, what did you hope to accomplish? I can't even remember what the first things you worked on when you came in were.
Yeah, the first things. I feel like this jumping in there was the ongoing project around this food insecurity report that like generations of interns before me had started working on, and a lot of different research gathering of like best practices, what was being done around the country in different places and different opportunities, and trying to figure out like how do we measure it, and how do we actually put this into a framework, and can we get something out there to kind of coalesce what food insecurity means for Pittsburgh, and try to connect things from there to really take informed action. And so I think jumping in, it was just very, I'm trying to remember now like where exactly I must have started, because what I really remember was working with Emily Persico on just the definitions and measurements of like how do we actually kind of quantify food insecurity in a way that makes sense for Pittsburgh, and like having big debates about different statistical methods and whatnot to try to have something make sense, and really cover the different areas, which I think I remember you at the time bringing up, which I think I didn't know about until starting the city, was like the UN framework around food insecurity, and having that be a really strong frame of reference to then really develop like, okay, criteria for how we can measure and report, and really like think about what are the gaps and what can be potentially done in the city to try to address some of those gaps.
That was really such an amazing time in the city, because food had finally been put into sustainability and resilience. So that opened up the door. Instead of just looking at food policy and land use and, urban agriculture, composting, that stuff, it took it to a different level. And farmers markets, we had already done that, took it to a different level where we could actually look at food insecurity. And you said generations of interns. Well, there are 3 generations per year of interns. So and you're right, we did start that with Maher in the summer of 2018. She was also from CMU, and she came to work with me for the summer and do her part of her program was an internship. And she started the layout of the Feed Pittsburgh report and the background research. And then the data, we were ready to do the data when you and Emily came in. And the debates and the conversation, it was just such a rich time in the city. And the city is so lucky to have had you guys who came in and gave your time and your brain power and your energy for free to help to frame this problem that the city has, whether there will be a solution or if anyone will look at it and create a solution from that. We did make suggestions through as part of the Feed Pittsburgh report, but it was just such a really exciting time to be doing this work in the city and with you and with Emily Persico. It was just awesome. Thank you. That was really great. And I'm really proud of the work that you guys did. It's amazing.
It was definitely a really awesome opportunity. And I think definitely is one of the things I feel most proud of. I feel like is, having been able to work and also, working with Emily to get the report actually out to a finish line and seeing it get published. I guess that's, I ended up being a unofficial intern for, beyond what was required for my program, because I was just, felt really passionate about the work. And I think it was, I remember when I first started, the one thing that you repeatedly said was like, policy just takes a long time. Any policy work takes a long time. And so it was nice to be around for a long enough time to actually be able to see the report get published, and also organizations then like reaching out and also using it as a frame of reference for how to really like frame and talk about food insecurity in Pittsburgh.
Yeah. And then the organization saying, well, this data is from 2019. Are you going to update it? I know it's a little, out of date now, but still, nobody's ever done it before. We did it. Just say thanks.
Right. I think I feel really proud of the methodology that we like worked on and put together. I feel like it really scales well. I think one of the things that is always kind of interesting is like, what are you trying to focus on? And I remember, the love of Baltimore and the healthy
still today have a food crush on Baltimore. Absolutely.
Yeah, the healthy food priority areas that they worked on in Baltimore, I think that obviously was an inspiration for us, but thinking about what made sense in Pittsburgh. And I think what was interesting was our use of a like relative scale of insecurity rather than an absolute scale, which meant that what we could really measure was ultimately was around equity. Because if any place like, sure, maybe if you get to a place where like, oh, things overall seem pretty good, you can still, using a relative framework, identify like, oh, wait, there's still inequity that exists. And so even, with that really allows that conversation to focus around equity. And I think that I think was something that felt like really good about how we ended up framing the healthy food priority areas. It's like, these are areas that are a priority because of the inequity. So I think that was something that, just really proud of.
Me too. And I know that we did the right thing and that it's an accurate map because it's the same map for other inequities in the city. Like, they're the same areas. And I mean, they're areas that everybody knows have been disinvested in over the years and kind of ignored, but nobody says anything out loud. So it was nice to like put it in writing. And like my German counterparts were like, so you have this now, you're going to solve it, right? And I was like, not necessarily. Like, I hope we put some energy into it, but that has yet to be seen. But that's really interesting.
I feel like in general, here in America, we're very good at identifying problems, but we're very bad at actually fixing any of them.
Absolutely. Well, it doesn't help capitalism at all, so why would we fix it? It's fine. It's fine. All right, well, we're going to take a little break, and when we come back, I want to talk about more of your food studies, and then I want to talk about your thesis and that whole area of thought around the trauma-informed planning, because that is really fascinating, and I think it's something that's not being talked about much, so we'll do that.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, welcome back from break. We're here with my guest, Chris Sue, on With Bowl and Spoon. And we were going to talk about, I wanted to talk about grad school. So you did food studies at Chatham. And as part of that, your area of deep dive, your thesis was trauma-informed planning, which was like right in line with your internship, which ended up, I'm not sure if that was which came first, the chicken or the egg, but yeah, why don't you talk about that? Something that I don't think is talked about a lot, dealing with the trauma.
Yeah. So I guess it was very kind of interesting ways of how I got there. So obviously I had a sense of like food policy and just policy in general being like, a really powerful tool in the toolbox for how to address food insecurity. And at the same time, while I was in grad school, my then girlfriend, now wife, was studying in a marriage and family therapy program. And one of the things that ended up really coming up a lot in the process was around like trauma and what does it mean to be informed by trauma when you are seeking to help patients or clients heal, and how you can approach things. And I think there was as well a lot of kind of conversations going on at that time when I was in grad school around like, having trauma-informed practices as well in other domains outside of just like healthcare, and how can it potentially be a part of like other ways of how we think about things and frame things. And a big driving factor as well was, I think at the time I was living in the Hill District in Pittsburgh, and I think very much hearing from neighbors the stories of just all that the Hill District was as they remembered, but also at the same time a lot of feeling of loss, and you could see that when you're driving around of different places, empty storefronts that like had not been able to really receive much investment, and the sense of loss to drive past that and see that every day, or the house down the street that just has been sitting there and no one is taking care of it. I think just all these different factors really kind of join together with the sense of like, oh, how my trauma informed approach go beyond something that is on an individual scale versus thinking more broadly. So the big thing around trauma informed care really comes out of this, I think, is work by like neuroscientists and biologists around what happens when you have stress and the response that your body has to stress over time, and that we all kind of have these kind of limits where that we can kind of handle on a day-to-day basis. But over time, there's kind of two ways of how it can look. You can have like an acute traumatic moment where something happens and it's just so intense that your body has a very, very strong response to that event. And then there's also chronic, which is meaning that like is a chronic form of stress. So some maybe it's not a stressful thing if it just happened one time, but it happens over and over and over and over again. So after many years, or however long, like it accumulates in a way where you aren't able to actually be resilient to that stressor. And so I think from this came research with children in particular, and also I guess tracking adults' experience as children with a framework called ACEs, which stands for Adverse Childhood, I think, Experiences. I can't believe I actually kind of almost remember the entire acronym. It's been a long time. But I think that research is really formative because it tracked how what children experience really can affect their adulthood outcomes. And that being a really key sign of like, okay, how can we potentially work to prevent some of these adverse childhood experiences? And in the Hill District, actually, an organization that is now called the Neighborhood Resilience Project, which is run by Reverend Paul Abernathy. He actually had this whole like sense of kind of like theory around trauma-informed planning and thinking about trauma not just on an individual level, which ACE is really focused on, but on a like communal level, because one of the ACEs thing is like seeing a family member be killed is an adverse childhood experience. And one of the things with just thinking about that is like that kind of event impacts more than just one person. It can impact a whole community. And how do you even measure those cumulative effects of where you have, if you're in your neighborhood, you're having a lot of like violent crime or people being killed, like that kind of, it's not just having a family member, but like knowing your friend's family member or other people that are in your community who are being killed, and just how that cumulative effect can really, really weigh down on it in a person, but then also even an entire community, and change, I guess, the framing, the narrative of what that community is. And then, yeah, so I think going into my thesis, it was really wanting to focus in on the neighborhood I was living in, and really care about the Hill District, and wanted to really dig into a particular very interesting thing that I noticed after I had moved there, which was that a grocery store had opened up in the neighborhood. And I sometimes went to this grocery store. It was a shop and save. And a lot of people did not have very good experiences with this grocery store. And I'll say, like, even for myself going there, it was like, yeah, I didn't feel like it was necessarily the best grocery store. At the same time, everyone, who had been in the community for much longer than I had, really talked about like how big of a deal it was to like have a grocery store. And there's this kind of like interesting disconnect that I felt, kind of like, there's this experience that people were really glad that there was a grocery store, but they didn't really also care for the grocery store. And it wasn't necessarily something that they use as their primary grocery shopping experience, which I think this was also backed up by research by the RAND Institute, and kind of doing a longitudinal study tracking residents in both Hill District and also Homewood, and just seeing like the differences in outcomes of people who lived in a neighborhood that received a new grocery store versus one that still did not. And I think that one of the fascinating things from that was how health outcomes actually improved in the Hill District, but people's grocery shopping behavior didn't actually change all that much, and how they acquired food didn't actually change that much. And I think that was such a fascinating piece there of like, yeah, what's going on? Like, how do you end up in a space where like suddenly things seem to be like better, but the grocery store is not actually being frequented, it's actually losing money, and like people complain about it all the time, and it actually ended up closing. And so like, whoa, like what's like what is going on here? And that really kind of spun the question for me to dig deeper into.
Yeah, the FRESH study is what you're talking about. PHRESH, FRESH.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's is there an answer?
Yeah. So I think that was what I wanted to dig into, and I think in my limited research, doing as a grad student and doing informational interviews in the midst of a pandemic, I think from that there were definitely a very strong kind of, I think the narrative pieces around really like what was the sense of like loss, and a sense of like communal trauma, and one of the big things that it came down to was like this this interesting thing with the grocery store, which on the one hand, it helped to reverse a long-standing sense that a lot of residents had, that the neighborhood does not receive investment. And a lot of history in Pittsburgh that goes into what happened to Hill District and redlining, and urban renewal that destroyed a lot of homes and businesses and really scatter a lot of communal ties in the Hill District. And I think for the community to then actually receive some investment, I think that was like a really big deal, and something that was a part of this sense of like, oh, we can really heal from this because here's an opportunity we're being invested in. At the same time, there's also this aspect of like, well, we're being invested in, but we're getting investment, and our investment, this investment is actually not that nice. Like if I go to a different grocery store, my experience is like so much better. And I'm like treated better, and the food quality feels higher, and all of these things that then also kind of drives this sense of like, oh, like we're getting invested in, but it's not actually like very good. And I think a quote that still sticks with me was from one of my neighbors that I interviewed, which was just like, we want to have nice things. We want to have like what other communities have. And I think there's this part of like, maybe people might feel like, oh, like, how can you complain? How can you be unhappy? Like, hey, like you haven't been getting investment. Now here's some investment. You should like really be celebrating that. And I think, yeah, like it was. People were grateful that there was investment. And at the same time, there's this part of like, well, the whole idea of like, oh, beggars can't be choosers or something is like, no, actually, that's completely wrong. Why shouldn't this community also have the same kind of choices and options that other neighborhoods have? And if, like whatever reasons you have going into that, like you're also layering that with a lot of historic trauma and racial trauma as well, that like you have to really, really think deeply of how do you actually work to address like that kind of trauma. And I think one of the things that really, really stuck out to me too, and was a big part of my research, was on the idea of neoliberal policy, which in a short definition is this kind of approach that really is trying to focus on private investment, and the government being more of a facilitator and less of a direct investor and owner. And I think fundamentally that was one of those things where like when it came to, you look at like what happened with urban renewal and all these different things that happened in the past, they happened under a time when people's belief in how the government worked was just so different. It was like, oh, the government should like do things, it should change things, like it should take over stuff and just do whatever it wants, and just having a lot more vested power in a way for the government to potentially act and move. And I think the neoliberal approach is like, if we just get some of this private stuff, try to like incentivize a outside business to come in and make things work for this community, that will fix the problem. That is going to be the solution. And I think that's part of just like, well, what got us into the mess wasn't a private like entity or a private corporation or a company. It was the government. And I think that aspect of like, so if you're going to fix it, you need to invest in the same kind of way or even more as the government than you did initially that caused all the damage. And I think that's just the gap where that kind of policy just re-traumatized, and it was re-traumatizing for a community, because ultimately when the grocery store went under, the perception is like, oh, like this is the community's fault, and blaming the community for not being able to maintain a grocery store versus thinking through like, oh, like why would that be the community's fault versus like us as an entire like city or state or a country, it's like we have failed to make sure people have equal access to food. And I think that the desire to like put that blame on individuals or even a community, like I think that ultimately is the outcomes of these like neoliberal approaches.
I think there are other layers and factors to include as well, like capitalism being inherently racist, and that's added to a lot of the problems as well, and just capitalism itself, like not thinking that, you know, if the profit margin isn't big enough, they're going to bail. It's a whole system problem.
I think, yeah, definitely. I think, you know, neoliberal policies definitely go hand in hand with what, I guess, with capitalism, the idea that like all we need to do is do some small tweaks to the system and it will like work better, versus perhaps the system needs some structural rethinking. And I think especially, you know, in thinking about the space of food, is like, you know, I think one can make an argument that, oh, okay, when you're talking about spaces of innovation and, you know, people building different kinds of technology and different things, like, yeah, like, okay, like maybe having a system where, you know, the people with the, you know, the ideas and the finances and all that, like things that work out, like they stay in business, and people that don't close, like, okay, maybe there's some space for something like that in a competitive market. But when you're talking about like people getting food, you know, it just starts to be like what you're saying, if food is tied with capitalism, is that fundamentally you're always going to have losers because it's competitive. And I mean, I think that it's just structurally like,
Yep.
if that's what you think is right, then I guess that's that. But that, I think, to me, that's definitely a fundamental aspect of like that isn't what the kind of society that I don't think any of us really want to live in, where to have food is competition, that there's this sense of scarcity that we need with food, rather than a sense of abundance, that we have enough to make sure that everyone is fed and no one needs to walk away being hungry.
The biggest lesson that I took away from food studies that I continue to put out there every day is, you know, air, water, and food. Those are the three things you need to survive. You know, people say, oh, clothing, or no, housing. No, you can live in places, you know, if everything went to hell and we were just like, you would need to breathe, you would need to drink water, and you would need to eat food, or you'll literally die within minutes, days, or weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, any of those things should not be something that people are judged about deserving.
Mm-hmm.
Period.
Yeah.
Those three things should be available, plentiful, and good quality.
Mm.
And yeah, we're talking about the air quality, the water quality.
Yeah.
You know, those are compromised for disenfranchised communities. You know, poor people get shafted, and all of the things that we need to literally survive as a human. So yeah, there's just so much wrong, but we fight the good fight and try and fix it.
Yeah.
But there are so many things that need to happen. There's not one solution, as you and I have discussed on many occasions.
Yeah. You know, I think with all that, like, you know, where I am now, so I still working at Google, still very passionate about food policy, and also very cognizant that like, you know, there's the concept of like, it takes a village, and that there's so many different gifts and skills that people bring to the table. One of I guess activist that was in Pittsburgh, I'm really forgetting her name right now. But I remember during the I guess height of the Black Lives Matter movement, and especially in Pittsburgh, I think, you know, participating in different ways, sometimes, you know, showing up in person to march. And you know, I think one of the things that she highlighted was how not everyone needs to show up in the same kind of way. And what's important is to show up in the ways that we can, and the ways that like we also are able to thrive ourselves. And I think, you know, it's like, it's not about martyrdom, it's about community. And I think that was just a really powerful, I think, concept of like, yeah, this work is not an individual work. Is this is a community effort, and sometimes people are marching, sometimes people are bringing water, sometimes people are providing like financial donations. And there's all these different aspects, and I think like same with in talking about food system and how to change the food system. And I think there's a huge part where for me where I feel like there's like the structural aspects are so big for change of however we set our defaults is mostly how we like operate, because if it's default, most people are going to go for that because it's just easier, and there's nothing inherently like wrong about that choice necessarily on an individual level. But there's a question of, can we change something structurally to make it easier for people to choose the better things for one another and better things for our planet and as a community. And I think so I think that's something with my work now, and really thinking about like what is the narrative and story that we also try to tell in the midst of all this. Of like I think I definitely have a lot of respect for academia, and also at the same time I think there's so much that in academia and even in different circles of activism, which can really tend toward despair and hopelessness, and kind of voices a prophetic doom of like, look how broken and wrong everything is. But I think what's really, really important is like, what is the message of hope, and what is the narrative of hope moving forward, even in the midst of what feels like very broken systems. So I think that for me, like really ultimately fundamentally like falls back onto my faith, and I think how as well like how like people can come together as a community and really tell a story together that is one that is of like love and connection, and this sense of like we sometimes it is like, I think this kind of goes all the way back to the beginning of like those big structural changes are clearly huge opportunities. Sometimes those small changes in a document can have a huge impact. And also I think there's this part where like sometimes small actions of love and displaying that in a very small scale also can have a huge impact in ways that we can't always as easily see or measure. But I think that's just part of like the narrative is we're all in this together. We're all in this to care for one another, care for the world around us. And yeah, I think that question of are you full? Are you fed? Are you filled? That like we can be people as a community which recognize that we can all have that together, and we don't need to be separated from that.
That's great philosophy. I haven't heard you philosophize before like that. That's wonderful. You just had some really amazing adventures. You mentioned you're a married guy, and you went on a couple pretty big trips to India and Taiwan with your lovely bride, and you had some pretty amazing food adventures there. Do you want to talk about any of that?
Yeah, I guess I think probably like different threads that I've thought about for India versus like Taiwan. But I think one thing I remember that I was very struck by in India was that there has been a food delivery service in India for like over 100 years.
Like grocery delivery?
No, like meal delivery.
Prepared? Oh, okay.
So it's the tiffins, and basically it was like prepared lunch boxes that these vendors would go and deliver. Like stores would prepare it, and then it get delivered to people at work or on the trains and everything. I think learning about that was just like also the idea of the milk delivery person in the US, that it's like there are very few things that are new under the sun. And these things of like, oh, like, look, we have Uber Eats or DoorDash, and you can get food, delivered to your doorstep. Like, oh, what a novel concept. And it's like, oh, how do you kind of structure things in ways that make sense. And, that just affects like how your society is run or whatnot. But I think that was a very like kind of a little eye-opening thing of just, oh, okay. Like if you kind of structure things around like people around that, then it's just like very normal. Like that becomes a really like cool thing that just exists, and it can, I think just like food delivery in general, this idea that we need to go to a single grocery store to get our food. Like I think there's like, oh, like rethinking models of food distribution that maybe sometimes is looking to the past or things that have already gone on for a long time that we can just be like, oh, actually that was a pretty good idea. We shouldn't maybe have gotten rid of that. Like that was a really good way for people to get food, and in some ways like it can be more equitable, and like it really can help with accessibility if people can't get out of their houses. And it's just like if that's the normal thing, then that it's just a very different mindset. So I think that was one that was just a little fun thing. I think in Taiwan, I guess Taiwan is very like personal, and I think I don't often have the ratatouille moment where you're eating something and it just like takes you like back to like something, in childhood or whatever. When I'm eating, I think, never quite that visceral. Like sometimes I'll be like, oh yeah, this is nice. Like it reminds me of growing up or something, but it doesn't necessarily bring me to like the place of tears. And when I was in Taiwan this past time, we ended up going to the town that my mom grew up in, and where my grandpa also grew up. And we went to this night market there, and I remember sitting down at this turkey rice stand and just getting, it's very simple. It's literally a bowl of white rice, and it's just this like, I guess like turkey consomme with a little bit of turkey on top, and they just kind of douse the rice a little bit. And I like ate it, and it's just like, it felt like eating that took me back like multiple generations. Like something about sitting there, it was like pouring actually that evening, but like you're just tucked away so you're not getting wet, sitting at this like food stall and just eating that bowl of turkey rice. I was just like overcome with this sense of emotion of like, oh, like I didn't even know how to describe it. It was almost like, oh, like maybe my grandpa, when he was younger, like he also came here, and maybe it wasn't like turkey rice specifically, but he would come to the night market and get some food and just sit. And I think just in the commotion of like hearing the voices and hearing the like life of everything around me, that it's just really just took me to what felt like best way to describe it, I feel like ancestral ratatouille experience. It was like, it wasn't even something I experienced in childhood. It was like, it felt like it was pulling me back a couple of generations.
Back
so yeah, it was very
heritage. Yes.
So yeah, it was very, very like powerful, and I really love that.
That's awesome. Well, I think that's a really good note to end on. Chris, thank you so much for all of the work that you did and all of the ideas and energy that you brought to city planning and the work that we did. I'm very proud of that, and I'm really glad to know you, and thank you so much for being on my podcast.
Yeah, I'm very, very glad to, and always lovely to have conversations.
Everyone knows that food is cool. No secret. Eat that food with a bowl and spoon. Take that spoon. Everyone knows that food is cool. No secret. Eat that food with a bowl and spoon.
With Bowl and Spoon is written, produced, and hosted by me, Shelly Danko Day. Copy editing by Carolyn Ristow, details reviewed. Original theme song was written and performed by Paul Labrise and Friends. You can listen to With Bowl and Spoon anywhere you get your podcasts. Follow us and send us questions or messages on Facebook and Instagram or on our website withbowlandspoon.com. Thanks for listening.